Sons of the Covenant, the legacy of Jacob. Before we dive into the story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so we can explore more amazing stories together. Chapter 1. The birth of a chosen line. The earliest dawn of biblical history. Jacob, son of Isaac and grandson of Abraham, was not just a man with a destiny, but the bearer of a divine promise. Even before he was born, his life was marked by struggle. While still in the womb, Jacob grappled with his twin brother Esau, and when the time came for their birth, Jacob emerged gripping his brother's heel, a sign of his lifelong tenacity and the start of his name's legacy. Jacob means supplanter, or he who grasps the heel, hinting at a journey riddled with conflict, cunning, and redemption. Jacob's story was never simple. He came from a lineage marked by favor and faith, but also by frailty and failure. His father Isaac had loved Esau, the rugged hunter, while his mother Rebekah favored Jacob, the quiet thinker. Encouraged by his mother, Jacob deceived his nearly blind father and stole Esau's birthright and blessing. Fearing his brother's wrath, Jacob fled to his uncle Laban's household in Haran, where he would live for many years, facing trials of his own. But even exile could not halt the divine plan that followed Jacob. One night, as he lay with a stone for a pillow, Jacob dreamed of a ladder stretching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending. At the top stood the Lord, who reaffirmed the covenant first made with Abraham. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. That dream marked a turning point. Jacob wasn't just a man running from his past, he was now a man chosen to carry the future. His years with Laban were filled with hard labor, deceit, and a complicated love triangle. Jacob fell in love with Rachel, but was tricked into marrying her sister Leah first. Over time, he fathered 12 sons through Leah, Rachel, and their maidservants Zilpah and Bilhah. Each birth was woven into the fierce rivalry between Rachel and Leah, with names reflecting the hopes, disappointments, and victories of their mothers. But even amid jealousy and struggle, something larger was unfolding. These sons would become the foundation of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's return to Canaan was not without fear. On the journey home, he learned that Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men. Terrified, Jacob sent gifts ahead, divided his camp, and prepared for the worst. But before the encounter, he spent the night alone, wrestling with a mysterious man until dawn. The struggle was physical, spiritual, and transformative. When morning came, the man blessed him and said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." That night, Jacob, now Israel, limped away with a dislocated hip and a renewed identity. He was no longer just a trickster or a fugitive. He had become the father of a people, the patriarch of a nation that would one day bless the world. The meeting with Esau turned out to be peaceful, an emotional reunion marked by forgiveness rather than revenge. Jacob then settled in the land of Canaan, where the story of his sons began to take center stage. Each son would come to represent not just a person, but a people. Their temperaments, decisions, and destinies would shape the character of their future tribes. Reuben, his firstborn by Leah, was expected to lead, but would later forfeit that role. Simeon and Levi, hot-tempered and vengeful, would face consequences for their violent actions. Judah, fourth-born but lion-hearted, would rise as the lineage of kings. Dan, the son of Bilhah, would become a shadowy figure, clever but spiritually turbulent. Naphtali would be free-spirited and eloquent. Gad, a fierce warrior. Asher, a man of prosperity and peace. Zebulun would anchor himself by the sea, a harbor of commerce and exchange. Issachar would be known for loyalty and labor. Joseph, the favored son of Rachel, would be rejected, betrayed, and rise to power in Egypt. And finally Benjamin, the last-born and dearly beloved, would emerge as both fierce and tragic. Though flawed and broken in many ways, these sons were part of a divine tapestry. God's plan didn't require perfect men, only willing hearts. The 12 sons of Jacob were born into a story that spanned generations. They carried within them the bloodline of a promise, the spark of a future they could not yet see, and in time, their descendants would become a nation. Their stories, with all their highs and lows, would be told for thousands of years, not because they were heroes, but because they were chosen. Chosen not for their strength, wisdom, or purity, but for the simple fact that God had decided to work through them. The birth of Jacob's sons was not just the formation of a large family, it was the beginning of a sacred legacy, a legacy that would stretch across deserts, through slavery, exile, rebellion, and redemption, a legacy that would one day lead to kings, prophets, and even the Messiah. This was not merely a family history, it was the foundation of faith for millions. And it all began with a man who held on tightly, wrestled through the night, and refused to let go until he was blessed. Chapter 2. Reuben, a lost birthright. Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob, the son of Leah, the wife Jacob never truly loved. From the moment of his birth, he was a symbol of hope for his mother, a woman caught in the shadows of her sister Rachel's beauty and Jacob's affections. Leah named him Reuben, meaning behold, a son, as if to say, now my husband will love me. But love cannot be forced. And though Reuben's birth brought her joy, it didn't bring her the devotion she longed for. Being the firstborn in ancient Israelite culture carried profound weight. It meant leadership, authority, and a double portion of inheritance. It was more than just birth order, it was destiny. Reuben was set to be the natural heir to Jacob's legacy, the one who would stand above his brothers. But what should have been his by right would later be taken from him, not by another's betrayal, but by his own choices. In his early years, Reuben showed signs of leadership. He looked after his younger brothers, kept an eye out for danger, and tried to live up to the weight of expectation placed on his shoulders. But beneath that sense of duty, there was a need perhaps unspoken to, and the affection his mother never received. Reuben carried not just the burden of leadership, but the weight of emotional legacy. The moment that defined his downfall came years later, and it wasn't on the battlefield or in a dramatic confrontation. It happened in a quiet moment of temptation and arrogance. After Rachel's death, Jacob had taken Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant, and the mother of two of his sons, into his tent. And Reuben, perhaps angry, confused, or seeking to assert control, committed an unspeakable act. He slept with her. It was not only a grave violation of family honor, but a direct affront to Jacob's authority. In that one reckless decision, Reuben tarnished his claim to the birthright. He didn't just sin sexually, he attempted to undermine his father, to claim power prematurely and forcefully. And though Jacob did not confront him immediately, he never forgot. Years passed. The family grew, the land changed, but wounds left unspoken don't heal, they simmer in silence. When Jacob, old and nearing death, gathered his sons to bless them, he finally spoke of what had long festered in his heart. To Reuben, he said, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength. Excelling in honor, excelling in power, turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel. For you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it. It was both a blessing and a judgment, a poetic lament of what could have been. Jacob acknowledged Reuben's potential, his position, his promise. But he also declared the bitter truth that instability, like turbulent water, had cost him everything. Reuben, the one who should have led the tribes of Israel, was passed over. His birthright was split. Kingship would go to Judah, priesthood to Levi, and a double portion of inheritance to Joseph. Yet Reuben's story does not end in disgrace. Like many who fall from great heights, he would later show glimpses of humility and redemption. When the brothers conspired to kill Joseph and throw him into a pit, it was Reuben who stepped in to save him. He urged them not to shed blood, planning in secret to rescue Joseph later and return him to their father. But while he was away, the others sold Joseph to slave traders. Reuben returned to the pit and found it empty. His plan had failed, and the grief in his voice was real. He tore his clothes in anguish, crying, "The boy is gone. Where shall I go now?" It was not just guilt, it was the cry of a man who had once lost his place through pride, and now again through helplessness. When famine struck, and the brothers had to go to Egypt for food, Reuben again tried to step up. Faced with the demand to bring Benjamin, Jacob's youngest and most beloved, Reuben offered his own two sons as a guarantee for Benjamin's safety. It was a desperate pledge, perhaps foolish, but it showed a desire to protect, to make amends. But by then, Reuben was no longer the leader. His influence among his brothers had waned. It was Judah, who eventually won their father's trust and took charge of the mission to Egypt. Reuben remained. In the background, a man who once had it all, but had lost his grip on destiny. Still, in the biblical narrative, there is mercy even for those who fail. Reuben's tribe would go on to become one of the 12 tribes of Israel, settled east of the Jordan River, though they never held the same prominence as Judah or Joseph. They were not cast out. Their name remained in the history of God's people not as a symbol of perfection, but as a reminder of fragile beginnings, squandered chances, and the grace to continue on. Reuben's life is a mirror for many who begin with privilege but stumble along the way. His story warns of the cost of impulse and pride, but it also invites us to see the possibility of restoration. He was not erased from the story, he was humbled within it. His name stands not as a monument to greatness, but as a lesson in human weakness and divine patience in a world that often glorifies the flawless. Reuben reminds us that leadership without self-control is unstable, that potential unguarded becomes a curse, and that true strength lies not in dominance, but in wisdom. His was a birthright lost but not a life wasted. Chapter 3, Simeon. The price of wrath. Simeon was Leah's second son, born into a household already burdened by rivalry and broken love. His name came from his mother's aching heart. Because the Lord heard that I was unloved, Leah said, He gave me this son also. She named him Simeon, meaning heard. But Simeon wasn't just heard, he would one day make himself remembered, though not for kindness or honor. His legacy would become forever tied to anger, vengeance, and a moment of unspeakable violence. From an early age, Simeon's spirit burned hot. He was the kind of child who didn't back down from a fight, who bristled with loyalty to his own, but had little tolerance for insults or injuries. He and his younger brother Levi were so close, in fact, that they often acted as one. Where Levi was sharp and calculating, Simeon was blunt and fierce. Together, they became a force fueled by blood ties and a sense of justice twisted by fury. That fury exploded in the town of Shechem. Their sister Dinah, Jacob's only daughter, had gone out to visit the women of the land. And there she caught the eye of Shechem, the prince of the Hivites. He took her, lay with her, and violated her. But then he said he loved her and wanted to marry her. It was a strange, jarring contradiction. Violation followed by proposal. He and his father, Hamor, approached Jacob and asked for her hand in marriage, offering to intermarry their people and share the land in peace. Jacob was stunned. His sons were away in the fields, and he kept quiet until they returned. When Simeon and Levi heard the news, their grief ignited into rage. It wasn't enough to be angry. It wasn't enough to reject the proposal. They wanted revenge, swift, devastating, unforgettable, with chilling calm. They plotted a trap, pretending to consider the marriage. They told the men of Shechem that they would agree on one condition: every male in the city must be circumcised. It was a clever lie wrapped in the language of faith. The Hivites, eager for alliance, agreed. And on the third day, when the pain of circumcision was most severe, Simeon and Levi took their swords and stormed the city. They didn't just kill Shechem. They didn't just punish the guilty. They slaughtered every man in the town. Then they plundered it, taking livestock, possessions, women, and children. What had begun as a family tragedy became a massacre. The line between justice and vengeance had been erased by the blade of Simeon's fury. When Jacob heard what they'd done, his heart broke again. Not only had his sons committed a horrific act, they had endangered the entire family. "You have brought trouble on me," Jacob said, "by making me obnoxious to the Canaanites and Perizzites. We are few in number, and they will unite against us and destroy us." But Simeon didn't apologize. Neither did Levi. "Should he have treated our sister like a prostitute?" they asked coldly. For them, it wasn't about diplomacy or survival. It was about honor, and they had taken it back in blood. Still, there would be consequences. Though Jacob remained mostly silent for years, he never forgot. When his life drew near its end, he gathered his sons for one final blessing. But what he gave Simeon and Levi was not a blessing, it was a reckoning. "Simeon and Levi are brothers, their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter their council. Let me not join their assembly. For they have killed men in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they pleased. Cursed be their anger, so fierce, and their fury, so cruel, I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. The words cut deeper than any sword. Jacob didn't curse them as men, but he cursed their wrath. That was the distinction. They were not evil, but their uncontrolled anger had made them dangerous, and their punishment would be dispersion. No land of their own, no unified legacy. Simeon would lose the strength of being a tribe with its own borders. His people would be absorbed into others, faded into the background of history. Indeed, centuries later, the tribe of Simeon would be allotted land within the territory of Judah, not as a separate, prominent tribe, but as one sharing the land of another. Their name remained, but their influence dwindled. They had once been powerful, now they were scattered, and yet, even in that downfall, there was a lesson, a mirror to every person who has ever acted out of rage. Simeon reminds us that anger, even when justified, can destroy more than it heals. That revenge, even when rooted in grief, rarely leads to peace. There's a thin line between standing up for what's right and becoming the very thing you hate. Simeon's story is not one of redemption, but of warning. It doesn't end with a second chance or a grand moment of forgiveness. It ends in quiet obscurity, a strong man whose strength devoured his future. But perhaps that, too, is a kind of redemption, not in rewriting the past, but in leaving behind a legacy that reminds future generations. Beware the power of wrath. It can burn so bright that it consumes the very purpose you were born to fulfill. Simeon, the son whose name meant heard, would eventually go unheard. But in that silence lies a message that speaks volumes. Chapter 4. Levi. From curse to calling, Levi was born, third in the line of Jacob and Leah's sons, and from the start, his mother's hopes clung tightly to him. Now at last my husband will become attached to me, she said when she bore him. Naming him Levi, joined or attached, but love, when coerced or hoped into existence, is rarely returned. Jacob still favored Rachel, and Levi, like his older brothers, grew up under the heavy cloud of a father's cold distance and a mother's quiet desperation. That childhood marked by emotional imbalance and a fractured home seemed to mold Levi into a man of intensity. He was close to Simeon, the second-born, and together they became a pair few dared to cross. But while Simeon acted from hot, unfiltered rage, Levi's actions revealed something sharper, calculating, even cruel. When their sister Dinah was defiled by Shechem, Levi and Simeon orchestrated a merciless plan of vengeance. With chilling precision, they convinced the men of Shechem to be circumcised, offering a false peace through shared faith. And then, while the men were still in pain and unable to fight, the brothers slaughtered every one of them with their swords. It wasn't just justice, it was bloodlust. The aftermath was devastating. Their father Jacob, though heartbroken over Dinah, was horrified at the massacre. "You've brought trouble on me," he told them, "making us a stench to the Canaanites." But neither Levi nor Simeon seemed remorseful. Their honor, in their eyes, had been defended no matter the cost. Time passed, Levi matured, but the stain of Shechem followed him. When Jacob gathered his sons in his final hours, he addressed Levi and Simeon together, speaking not only as a father but as a judge. "Simeon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are in their hands. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel." It was a devastating judgment. Scattered, dispersed, no central home, no tribe with borders. For Levi, it seemed his fate was sealed, not with a legacy of honor, but with one of rejection. He would not lead a tribe. His descendants would be nomads among their brothers. But God, in his mysterious grace, isn't bound by curses. In fact, sometimes he reshapes them into callings. Centuries later, after Jacob's descendants had become a nation of slaves in Egypt, a man named Moses was born into the tribe of Levi. He was drawn from the water, raised in Pharaoh's palace, and called by God to confront the very empire that once embraced him. When Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt and into freedom, Levi's blood ran through his veins at Mount Sinai. After the people had committed a grave sin by worshiping the golden calf, Moses called for judgment. "Whoever is for the Lord," he shouted, "come to me." And it was the sons of Levi who rallied to his side. With swords once used in reckless violence, they now acted on behalf of holiness. executing justice against those who had rebelled. It was a brutal day, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, Levi's passion was not directed at personal vengeance but at protecting the covenant, and God saw it. From that moment, the tribe of Levi was set apart not for land or power, but for service. They would not inherit territory like the other tribes, but instead would become priests and caretakers of the tabernacle. The very curse that had once doomed them to dispersion became the door to divine purpose. They would live among all the tribes, teaching the law, guarding worship, offering sacrifices, and reminding the people of God's holiness. Levi's name would no longer conjure fear, it would inspire reverence. Aaron, Moses' brother, became the first high priest. His descendants, the Kohanim, would carry the sacred duties of intercession. The Levites would sing in the temple, transport the Ark of the Covenant, and serve as the spiritual backbone of the nation. They were scattered, yes, but not as a punishment anymore. They were scattered to bless. Their lack of land forced them to depend entirely on God. Their inheritance was not soil, it was sacredness. And so the story of Levi was rewritten. From the son who shed blood in Shechem to the tribe that stood between God and his people, Levi's legacy became one of transformation. He embodied what it means to be refined by fire, to let passion be purified by purpose. His was a life redeemed, not erased or forgotten, but reshaped by the hand of the divine. Even centuries later, when prophets cried out against corruption in Israel, the memory of Levi's faithfulness still stood. In Malachi, God says, "My covenant was with Levi, a covenant of life and peace, and I gave them to him." This called for reverence, and he revered me and stood in awe of my name. From cursed to called, from scatterer of wrath to bearer of sacred trust, Levi's journey reminds us that no past is beyond redemption, no passion too wild to be harnessed for good. He was not the perfect son, but in God's hands, he became something greater, a servant who stood in the gap, a name that became synonymous with worship, discipline, and divine order. Chapter 5, Judah. The lion among brothers. Judah was the fourth son of Jacob and Leah. By the time he was born, his mother's heart had grown weary from the ache of being unloved. She had named her first three sons Reuben, Simeon, and Levi with cries of longing and hope for Jacob's affection. But when Judah arrived, something shifted. "This time I will praise the Lord," she said. And so, she named him Judah, praise. Judah's life would become a study in contradiction, flawed yet favored, reckless yet redeemed. He was not the firstborn, nor the most righteous. He was not a prophet or a priest. Yet his name would rise above the rest, and his legacy would shape the destiny of kings and ultimately, the Messiah. His early years were marked by the chaos that always seemed to swirl around Jacob's household. Sibling rivalries ran deep, jealousy festered, and no one stirred the pot quite like Joseph, the beloved son of Rachel, whose dreams of dominance enraged his older brothers. But it was Judah, not Reuben or Simeon, who played a pivotal role in what came next when the brothers plotted to kill Joseph. It was Judah who suggested a different plan. "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites." It was a cold calculation, but one that spared Joseph's life. Judah didn't act out of mercy so much as greed, but that single decision changed everything. After Joseph was sold, Judah drifted from the family. Perhaps guilt drove him away, or maybe he was simply tired of the dysfunction. Whatever the reason, he went off on his own, married a Canaanite woman, and began raising sons of his own. But even in this new chapter, pain followed him. His firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord and was struck down. Judah told his second son, Onan, to fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law and provide offspring for Tamar, Er's widow. But Onan refused and met the same fate, fearing that his third son, Shelah, would also die. Judah sent Tamar away, promising to call for her when Shelah was older, but he never intended to do so. Tamar, wronged and cast aside, took matters into her own hands. Disguising herself as a prostitute, she tricked Judah into sleeping with her months later. When word came that Tamar was pregnant, Judah was enraged. "Bring her out and burn her," he said. But Tamar presented the items he had left behind, his seal, cord, and staff, and quietly revealed the truth. Judah was stunned. In front of everyone, he admitted, "She is more righteous than I." It was a moment of humility, raw and rare. He had failed, not just as a father, but as a man of integrity, and in that confession, something inside him began to change. The Judah who returned to his family years later was not the same man who sold Joseph. He had grown, softened. He now carried the weight of his mistakes, and with it, a sense of responsibility he'd never shown before. When famine struck, and the brothers journeyed to Egypt seeking food, it was Judah who emerged as a true leader. The man who once betrayed a brother now stood ready to sacrifice himself for another. Joseph, disguised as an Egyptian ruler, demanded that the brothers bring Benjamin, the youngest and most beloved son of Jacob, to Egypt. It was a test, and when Benjamin was accused of theft and threatened with slavery, it was Judah who stepped forward. "Please," he pleaded, "let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me?" Gone was the schemer. Gone was the self-serving brother. In his place stood a man willing to bear the burden of another's guilt, to spare his father more heartbreak. It was that speech full of courage, love, and repentance that broke Joseph's heart. He revealed his identity in tears, and the family was reunited. Jacob never forgot that moment. On his deathbed, when he gathered his sons for one final blessing, the words he spoke over Judah soared higher than any other. "Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub. Judah, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he too, whom it belongs, shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his." It was a prophetic declaration. Though Judah was not the firstborn, the right to rule would pass to him. Kings would come from his line: David, Solomon, and eventually the Messiah himself. Judah had begun his life with betrayal and deceit, but his journey didn't end there. Through heartbreak, failure, confession, and redemption, he became a symbol of transformation. His lion-like courage didn't come from pride but from the humility of a man who knew what it meant to fall and rise again. In the end, Judah wasn't chosen because he was perfect. He was chosen because he changed, because he faced his failures head-on, because he learned that leadership is not about dominance but about sacrifice, and because, when it mattered most, he stood up not for himself, but for someone else. That is the legacy of Judah, not the sin, but the turning, not the fall, but the rise. He was a lion not because he roared loudest but because he found the courage to protect, to confess, and to lead with a heart that had been broken and made whole again. Chapter 6. Dan. The serpent in the Pathan was the first son born to Jacob through Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant. Rachel, still unable to bear children herself, had given Bilhah to Jacob in desperation, determined not to fall behind her sister Leah in the unspoken competition for their husband's heart. When Bilhah bore a son, Rachel named him Dan, saying, "God has vindicated me. He has heard my plea and given me a son." His name, Dan, meant judge. Dan's birth was not one of joyful love, but of rivalry and longing. From the very beginning, his existence carried the weight of someone else's struggle, not a natural air of affection, but a symbol of spiritual and emotional warfare. And like his name suggested, judgment would become a theme woven through his legacy. Dan was raised in a household brimming with tension. He was not one of Leah's sons, nor Rachel's true child. He was caught in the margins, loved enough to be counted, but never prominent enough to lead. He grew up in the shadows of Reuben's status, Levi's intensity, Judah's rise, and Joseph's favor. In a family of loud voices and big destinies, Dan had to find his place in the spaces between. Not much is told of Dan as a boy, and perhaps that's telling. He never stood at the center of drama. He didn't rebel like Reuben or rage like Simeon and Levi. He wasn't chosen like Joseph or humbled like Judah. He watched, he listened, he absorbed. And sometimes, that kind of silence breeds cunning. When Jacob blessed his sons at the end of his life, he looked at Dan and said something mysterious, something that would linger long after the words were spoken. Dan will provide justice for his peoples, one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a serpent by the roadside, a viper along the path, that bites the horse's heel so that its rider tumbles backward. I look for your deliverance, Lord. It was a prophecy unlike any other. Dan would be a judge, a bringer of justice, but he would do so like a snake in the grass, silent, subtle, striking without warning. His power wouldn't be in brute strength or royal decree, but in cleverness, unpredictability, and influence from below. There's something unsettling about that imagery. A serpent isn't typically a symbol of trust. It doesn't stand and roar, it slithers and waits. And perhaps that's what defined Dan's future, the power of manipulation, the danger of misused judgment. Centuries later, the tribe of Dan would carve out a territory in the north of Israel, but not without controversy. Originally allotted land near the Philistines, Dan's people struggled to hold it. So, instead of fighting for their inheritance, they migrated north, attacked the quiet town of Laish, and claimed it as their own, renaming it Dan. It was a move that seemed strategic, almost ruthless. They didn't conquer in open battle. They struck like a serpent, targeting a vulnerable settlement, exploiting weakness instead of meeting opposition head-on. In that action, Jacob's words echoed through history, but the tribe of Dan wasn't only defined by warfare. They also became one of the first tribes to introduce idol worship to Israel. In the newly named city of Dan, they set up a carved image, installed their own priesthood, and created a center of worship separate from the tabernacle. In a time when Israel was still forming its identity, Dan's deviation set a dangerous precedent. What began as a quiet drift away from tradition became a full-blown rebellion against the order God had established. Dan, once named judge, had become a source of spiritual confusion, and yet, the story of Dan is not entirely dark. One of the most famous judges in Israel's history came from this tribe, Samson. Samson was born with divine purpose. His strength was legendary, his mission clear, to deliver Israel from the Philistines. But his life, like Dan's prophecy, was tangled in contradiction. He was mighty, but reckless, chosen, yet impulsive. A judge with the power of a warrior, but the heart of a man who often fell prey to temptation. Samson's story was dramatic, riddled with battles, betrayal, and personal tragedy. He judged Israel for 20 years, but often seemed to fight more for himself than for his people. Yet, in his final act, blinded and broken, he turned back to God and brought down a temple on the heads of Israel's enemies, an act of both judgment and sacrifice. Samson embodied everything Jacob had seen in Dan, a bringer of justice who struck from the shadows, a serpent-like figure whose greatest impact came not from leadership, but from the way he destabilized the enemy. He was a paradox, just like his tribe, but Dan's legacy would fade in later genealogies, particularly in the book of Revelation. The tribe of Dan is curiously absent. The other tribes are named, sealed, and honored, but Dan is not mentioned. Some scholars see this as a consequence of their idolatry. Others believe it reflects the tribe's tendency to step away from the path laid out by God. Dan began as a cry for justice. His life was a response to a mother's desperation and a father's silence. His tribe was clever, ambitious, and spiritually restless. They fought for a place of their own, but in doing so, they drifted from the heart of the nation and, perhaps, from the heart of God. His story is a warning that judgment, when untethered from humility, becomes manipulation. That cunning without conviction leads to compromise. That the serpent's strike may be powerful, but it rarely leads to peace. Dan was not forgotten, but neither was he celebrated. He reminds us that the way we wield influence matters just as much as the outcome it brings. That justice must be rooted in truth, not vengeance or ambition. And that silence, though often overlooked, can shape the future for better or worse. Chapter 7. Naphtali. The free spirit. Naphtali was the second son born to Jacob through Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant. His birth came during a time of intense rivalry between Rachel and her sister Leah, two women locked in a struggle for love, dignity, and dominance in a family divided by favoritism. When Bilhah bore Jacob a second son, Rachel named him Naphtali, saying, "I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have prevailed," and so his name meant my struggle from the beginning. Naphtali was marked by the emotional battles of those around him. He was born not from peace or passion, but from conflict. He carried the weight of someone else's competition and was raised in a household where love was rarely simple. Yet as he grew, Naphtali seemed to take on a spirit that stood apart from the rivalry that birthed him. While others grew heavy with bitterness or ambition, Naphtali moved with a different rhythm, more wild, more free. He wasn't the oldest or the strongest. He didn't command the respect of Reuben or the reverence of Judah, but he didn't need to. Naphtali was the kind of person who found his place not by demanding it, but by living it. He had a quick wit, a bright mind, and a way of speaking that made people listen. There was something fluid about him, unpredictable, like the wind, but always refreshing. When Jacob gathered his sons, in his final hours, the words he spoke over Naphtali were brief but vivid. Naphtali is a doset, fruit that bears beautiful fawns. It was poetry in the middle of prophecy. While others were compared to lions, serpents, or warriors, Naphtali was likened to a graceful deer, swift, elegant, untethered. His was a blessing of movement, beauty, and fertility. Jacob didn't see in him a conqueror or ruler, but a spirit that brought life and joy wherever it went. Some might have seen that as lesser, but in a family that's so often fractured under the weight of power plays and jealousy, Naphtali's freedom was a kind of strength. He was untouched by the obsession for dominance. His value wasn't found in control, it was in contribution. The tribe of Naphtali, descended from this free-spirited son, would come to settle in the north of Israel, in a region lush with beauty by the Sea of Galilee, and stretching toward the Lebanon mountains. Their land was fertile, scenic, and perfectly placed between the sea and the highlands. It became a crossroads of culture, commerce, and creativity. Though not as dominant militarily as Judah or Ephraim, Naphtali's descendants became known for their bravery and wisdom. In the Song of Deborah, the prophetess praised Naphtali for risking their lives on the battlefield against the Canaanites. They were not idle or passive. When it mattered, they stood up, but they did so not from a thirst for power but from a commitment to justice. Centuries later, the region of Naphtali would be known by another name, Galilee, and it was there on those hills and lake shores that a carpenter's son named Jesus would begin his ministry. He would walk the roads of Naphtali. He would teach by its waters. He would call fishermen, speak in parables, and heal the broken. And the words of the prophet Isaiah would echo through history. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations. By the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. From the tribe once described as a running deer would come the first light of the Messiah's mission. Naphtali's land became the launching point for the hope of the world. It's easy to overlook people like Naphtali. They don't fight for the spotlight. They don't command armies or demand loyalty. But they have a way of slipping into the soul of a nation and changing it. Quietly, they move through life like poetry in motion, graceful, grounded, and undeniably needed. Naphtali's story reminds us that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it runs like a deer, sings like a bird, or smiles with peace. His tribe was not known for building walls or fortresses but for being a place of beauty, promise, and spiritual awakening. He is the reminder that in the struggle of life, not every victory is won by force. Some are won by joy, some by presence, some by simply showing up and being fully alive. Naphtali, the son born from Rachel's competition, became a symbol of what it looks like to live beyond competition. He wasn't weighed down by resentment or driven by legacy. He just lived fully, gracefully, and faithfully in a world obsessed with speed, control, and noise. Naphtali teaches us the sacredness of movement and the holiness of peace. He reminds us that not all blessings come in the form of authority, some come in the form of freedom. And perhaps the most beautiful part of his story is this: though he never stood at the front of the stage, his land became the first to receive the light of the world. What greater honor could there be? Chapter 8. Gad, the warrior of the frontier. Gad was the seventh son of Jacob, born to Zilpah, Leah's maidservant. By the time he entered the world, the household of Jacob had long since become a battleground of affection and ambition. The women vied for love and status, and children were their currency. When Zilpah gave birth to Gad, Leah declared, "What good fortune!" So he was named Gad, meaning fortune or troop. Gad's arrival was marked not by dreams or prophecy, but by strategy. He was a part of a growing army of sons, each representing not only a mother's hope, but a stake in Jacob's legacy. Yet Gad would grow into more than just a number in the birth order. He would become a fighter, rugged, fierce, and unshakably loyal. From his earliest days, Gad showed signs of a frontier spirit. He wasn't one to be content with comfort or routine. While some of his brothers found their place within the heart of the family, or near the center of the promised land, Gad seemed to gravitate toward the edge where danger lived, where borders needed defending, where the unknown called out. When Jacob gathered his sons to speak final blessings over their lives, his words for Gad reflected the man's essence. Gad will be attacked by a band of raiders, but he will attack them at their heels. It was a short blessing, but one filled with meaning. Jacob saw in Gad the soul of a warrior, not one who always stands in the center of attention, but one who holds the line when others fall. A defender, a counterpuncher, someone who may be struck down, but will always rise again. And that's exactly what the tribe of Gad became. When the Israelites were journeying to the promised land, Gad's descendants saw the land east of the Jordan River, a rugged, open terrain perfect for livestock and freedom. It wasn't within the traditional boundaries of Canaan, but they asked Moses if they could settle there anyway. At first, Moses was furious. He feared Gad and their neighbors, the Reubenites, were abandoning their fellow Israelites before the conquest even began. But Gad made a bold pledge. They would go with the rest of Israel into battle, fight on the front lines, and only afterward return to settle their land. Moses accepted the deal, and Gad kept their word. They fought alongside their brothers. They bled beside them. They proved that even from across the river, their loyalty ran deep. They were warriors not just for their own people but for all of Israel. Their territory would be vulnerable. Located east of the Jordan, Gad's land became the buffer zone between Israel and its enemies. They lived with a sword in hand and an eye on the horizon. Raids were frequent. Battles were inevitable. But that's where Gad thrived. They didn't build palaces, they built outposts. Their homes were strongholds. Their sons were soldiers. When the historian chronicled Israel's warriors, he spoke of Gad's men. In awe, some Gadites defected to David at his stronghold in the wilderness. They were brave warriors, ready for battle, able to handle the shield and spear. Their faces were the faces of lions, and they were as swift as gazelles in the mountains. These were no ordinary men. They crossed the Jordan during flood season, storming through the river like it was dry land. They were fearless, faithful, and fierce. Even when surrounded, Gad's warriors never gave up the fight. But theirs was not just a physical strength. Gad carried with it a spiritual symbolism that God blesses those who protect the vulnerable, stand firm under pressure, and fight not just for self-preservation but for community. In many ways, Gad was the quiet backbone of Israel's defense. They weren't the priests who entered the temple, or the kings who sat on the throne, but they were the watchmen, the border guards, the ones who stayed awake while others slept. There's something deeply American about Gad's story, something frontier-like. His tribe reminds us of pioneers who settled on the edge of the wilderness, who carved out homes in harsh terrain, who protected what they built with grit and grit alone. Gad didn't need luxury or ease. He needed purpose, and he found it in protecting others. But Gad's story is also a caution. Living on the edge comes with risks, not just physical, but spiritual. Over time, the tribes that settled east of the Jordan, including Gad, became distant not only geographically, but spiritually. They were often the first to be attacked, the first to drift, the first to be taken into exile. It's the price of living on the border. You guard the gate, but you risk becoming detached from the heart. Gad's courage was undeniable, but his tribe's future would fade in later generations. The warrior's legacy endured, but his name grew quiet. Yet even in that silence, Gad's story echoes. He teaches us that fortune is not always found in peace, but often in the battle. That blessing doesn't always look like abundance. It can look like resilience, that God honors the ones who stand their ground, who defend others, and who face the storm with steel in their souls. Gad never tried to be the loudest voice or the central hero. He didn't seek the spotlight, he sought the struggle, and in that choice, he found his calling. He He was born into a family of striving and scheming, but he became a man of substance and strength, a guardian of the gates. Chapter 9. Asher. The blessed provider Asher was the second son of Zilpah, Leah's maidservant, and the eighth son of Jacob. His name, meaning happy or blessed, came from Leah's joy at his birth. "How happy I am," she said. "The women will call me happy," in a family driven by jealousy and rivalry. Asher's rival brought something rare, laughter. From the moment he entered the world, his very name stood as a declaration of contentment in a house that had known very little of it. But Asher was not born from romantic love or divine promise. He was born from strategy, Leah using her maidservant to gain more favor in Jacob's eyes. Yet somehow, Asher seemed untouched by that struggle. His life would come to reflect his name, full of goodness, provision, and peace. Unlike his brothers, who stirred up drama, like Reuben with his impulsiveness, Simeon and Levi with their wrath, or Judah with his complex path to leadership, Asher stayed quiet. He didn't lead armies, challenge birthrights, or scheme against his siblings. He simply thrived. Jacob's blessing to Asher reflected that essence perfectly. Asher's food will be rich. He will provide delicacies fit for a king. It wasn't a warrior's prophecy. It wasn't a ruler's promise. It was a portrait of prosperity. Asher would be the one who fed others, who brought richness to the table, who turned soil into sustenance and sustenance into celebration. His descendants would go on to settle in a fertile strip of land along the Mediterranean Sea in northern Israel. The region was blessed with olive trees, vineyards, and the kind of terrain that produced abundance. Year after year, Asher's tribe became known for agriculture, for oil production, and for wealth. Their name was associated with richness, not only of food, but of spirit. In a world often consumed with battle and ambition, Asher offered something different. He represented provision, community, the joy of a well-set table, the sacredness of contentment. The prophet Moses, before his death, echoed this theme in his blessing over Asher. "Most blessed of sons is Asher. Let him be favored by his brothers, and let him bathe his feet in oil. The bolts of your gates will be iron and bronze, and your strength will equal your days." Oil on the feet was a symbol of luxury, of peace and comfort. Iron and bronze gates signified security and strength. Moses saw in Asher not only a life of blessing but of resilience. He would be strong without being hard, rich without being greedy, generous without being proud. Yet Asher's role in Israel wasn't just about prosperity. In subtle ways, he brought balance to the larger picture. His tribe, though not dominant militarily or politically, helped keep the nation grounded. While others fought or ruled, Asher nurtured. His people were the kind who made others feel at home. They were the tribe who, while others chased glory, chose goodness. And sometimes, it's the good-hearted who are most needed when the world starts to fall apart. When the child Jesus was brought to the temple in Jerusalem as a newborn, the Gospel of Luke tells of an old prophetess named Anna, daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. She had lived in the temple for decades, worshiping day and night, praying and fasting. And when she saw the baby Jesus, she gave thanks to God and began telling everyone who was waiting for redemption. It's a quiet moment in Scripture, easy to overlook, but it speaks volumes about Asher's enduring legacy. While the powerful stood in palaces and the proud waited for a warrior Messiah, it was a widow from the tribe of Asher who recognized the Savior. Her spirit was attuned not to status, but to truth. That, too, was Asher's gift, spiritual clarity born from a life of peace and devotion. The tribe of Asher never led Israel, never rebelled, never fractured the kingdom, but they stood firm, they provided, they worshiped. They passed on a legacy not of kingship but of kindness, not of conquest but of character. Asher teaches us something vital in a world that chases headlines and power. That it's okay to be the one who brings joy instead of noise. That preparing a meal, planting a vineyard, or raising a faithful family can be as holy as leading an army. That happiness isn't shallow, it's sacred when rooted in gratitude and love. He reminds us that not every story must be marked by drama to be meaningful. Some stories matter because they endure quietly, humbly, generously. Asher's portion was rich, not just in land, but in heart. He was a man of abundance, not hoarded, but shared, and in that, his name was fulfilled. happy, not because he was without struggle, but because he chose joy through it. In a household of brokenness, Asher brought blessing. In a nation torn by conflict, his tribe brought nourishment. And in a world still searching for peace, his legacy whispers, sometimes the greatest power lies in provision, in presence, and in peace. Chapter 10, Benjamin. The beloved and the brave of Benjamin was the 12th and final son of Jacob and the second son born to Rachel, the wife Jacob truly loved. His story began in heartbreak, as Rachel gave birth to him during a difficult journey. She knew she wouldn't survive. With her last breath, she named her son Benoni, meaning son of my sorrow. But Jacob, refusing to let his son be defined by grief, renamed him Benjamin, son of my right hand. And so, Benjamin was born into both pain and promise. He would carry the weight of his mother's death, but also the blessing of his father's deepest affection. In a family filled with tension, betrayal, and rivalry, Benjamin stood apart, loved from the moment he entered the world, protected, even cherished. He was the youngest, the baby of the family, and Jacob loved him fiercely. After Joseph was presumed dead, Benjamin became the center of Jacob's world, his last living connection to Rachel. Jacob would not let him out of his sight, and when famine swept the land and the brothers had to go to Egypt for food, Jacob hesitated to send Benjamin along. He feared losing him more than he feared starvation. But Joseph, now second in command in Egypt and unrecognizable to his brothers, demanded that they bring their youngest brother if they wanted more grain. It was a test, and Jacob, with great reluctance, finally let Benjamin go. The journey to Egypt would change everything. When Benjamin arrived, Joseph was overwhelmed. After years of loss and longing, he finally saw his younger brother again. Joseph invited them to his home, wept in private, and had a meal prepared for them. And during the meal, Benjamin received 5 times more food than his brothers. It was a silent signal, a glimpse of Joseph's love. But the real test came next. Joseph planted his silver cup in Benjamin's sack and then accused the brothers of theft. When the cup was found, Joseph declared that Benjamin would stay as his slave. The brothers were shocked and heartbroken. Years earlier, they had sold Joseph into slavery without a second thought. But this time, they refused to abandon their youngest brother. Judah stepped forward. "Let me stay in his place," he pleaded. "Please, do not let my father lose another son." It was that moment, their willingness to sacrifice for Benjamin, that broke Joseph's heart. He revealed himself to his brothers and forgave them. And Benjamin, he embraced his long-lost brother with no words of blame, only tears and joy. When Jacob was on his deathbed, he blessed each of his sons. His words for Benjamin were poetic and powerful. "Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey. In the evening he divides the plunder." It was a curious image. The youngest son, gentle, beloved, described as a fierce predator. But there was a truth hidden within it. Though Benjamin was born into tenderness, his descendants would grow into warriors. The tribe of Benjamin became one of the smallest but most fearless tribes in all of Israel. They lived in the rugged hill country between Ephraim and Judah, a land filled with caves and high places. The terrain bred toughness. So did their history. In the time of the Judges, the tribe of Benjamin was nearly wiped out during a civil war. Their fighters were so skilled, so relentless, that it took all of Israel's other tribes to bring them down. Even then, the victory came at a great cost, and a deep sorrow settled over the nation. The tribe of Benjamin had almost vanished, but they survived and thrived. From their ranks came some of Israel's greatest warriors. They were known for their left-handed slingers, capable of hurling stones with deadly precision. They were fast, brave, and battle-hardened. Benjamin may have been the youngest tribe, but they never fought like the smallest. The first king of Israel, Saul, came from Benjamin. His reign would be a mix of promise and downfall. But his rise proved that Benjamin was no longer just the baby of the family. It was now a tribe capable of leading a nation. Centuries later, another Benjamite would emerge, not as a king, but as a scholar, a zealot, and eventually an apostle. Saul of Tarsus, better known as Paul, would become one of the greatest voices in Christian history. He once persecuted followers of Jesus, believing he was defending God's truth. But then, on the road to Damascus, He encountered Christ and everything changed. Paul's conversion was as radical as his mission. He became a messenger to the Gentiles, a church planter, a writer of letters that would shape theology for centuries. His intensity, his intellect, his fire, they were all traits that echoed the legacy of his tribe. Benjamin's story is one of paradox. He was born in sorrow, yet named in strength. He was the youngest, yet his tribe produced kings and apostles. He was beloved and brave, gentle yet fierce. In a family where so many brothers stumbled, betrayed, or fell, Benjamin remained innocent and marked by scandal or shame. But his descendants didn't remain in the shadows. They stood up, fought back, and became essential to Israel's history. He reminds us that our beginning doesn't determine our end, that the smallest voice can one day speak with power, that the one born in tears can grow into a legacy of strength. Benjamin, the son of Jacob's right hand, became more than a memory of Rachel's death. He became a symbol of God's ability to bring courage from sorrow, greatness from humility, and victory from pain. He was the beloved and the brave,